Good evening, everyone. I'm Yolanda Daniels, an associate professor of architecture here at MIT and the chair of the Lecture and Exhibitions Committee. Thank you for joining us for tonight's installment of the Fall 2022 lecture series. We appreciate your presence both in person and online. I'd like to begin the evening by thanking the department and the Lecture and Exhibitions Committee members, especially Amanda Moore, and the and the other members for all of their hard work. I'd also like to thank the students and staff who are assisting for tonight's event. In the spirit of acknowledgements, I'll also read MIT's land acknowledgement. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. MIT acknowledges Indigenous nations as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. We acknowledge the painful history of expulsions, genocide, and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected from time immemorial to this land on which we gather. Next, Nicola Twilley, the SA&P department head, will do tonight's introductions.
Thank you, Yolande, and also for doing such an amazing job leading and coordinating our lectures and exhibitions, which are truly amazing and delightful this semester, including tonight's guests. So when I spent a decade of my life convincing myself that at least a few people might like to read a strangely structured book that combined reflections on Christian Dior, bras and girdles, John F. Kennedy, the abrasive qualities of moon dust, and the precise dynamics of explosive depressurization, it was, as you might imagine, a bit of an individual obsession. Yet one of the best and most wonderful things I learned in the process after publication was that we don't ultimately put our work in the world to say something as much as we do it to find people to talk to. And even before I had actually finally published the book in question, I was approached and now struck up what is now a treasured friendship with tonight's lecturer, Geoff Manaugh, and his remarkable partner and collaborator, Nicola Twilley. They were both also already known to me from their own strange and remarkable obsessions with food, geology, architectural landscape, speculation, and ultimately, very timely for this week and the opening of our larger conversation of design at MIT with the Morningside Academy. Design is a way of wondering about the world as it is and thinking into its best and most interesting future. This led to more than a few adventures, most recently a year spent with Geoff in my last year-long studio at UC Berkeley, looking at the questions of science fiction and the future of California's ecology, with a remarkable set of students and collaborators. And it leads tonight via an invitation gratefully supported by our Lectures and Exhibitions Committee to this lecture and book talk. A few more formal notes for the record. Nicola Twilley is the co-host of the award-winning podcast Gastropod, a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, and appropriately enough for MIT, her writing has been honored with a AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award, was selected for inclusion into the Best American Science and Nature Writing Collection, and she was honored with a 2021 MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellowship, which she unfortunately experienced, as all of us experienced MIT that year, virtually. Geoff Manaugh is a writer regularly publishing in the New York Times Magazine, Wired, The Atlantic, and many other venues, is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, A Burglar's Guide to the City, and writes the long-running architecture and technology website, Building Blog. He's taught not only with me at Berkeley, but also at Columbia and USC, and his work has been supported by, on the one hand, the Graham Foundation, and on the other hand, Netflix, which recently selected his short story, optioned his short story Ernest, under the title We Have a Ghost, for premiere in 2023. Together, Twilley and Manaugh were the inaugural directors of Studio X New York City at Columbia University's GCEP, and also together the co-authors of Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine, chosen by NPR, Time Magazine, the Financial Times, and The Guardian of one of the best books of 2021, and the subject of tonight's lecture. We are joined for Q&A tonight, both online and in person, by Krista Maleva-Frank, a second-year PhD student in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture and art. Krista studies modern objects, interiors, and ecologies at all scales, and she holds a BA magna cum laude in art history and French literature from Williams, and an MPhil in the history of art and architecture from the University of Cambridge on a Herschel Smith Fellowship. So Krista is going to dazzle us with questions and conversation after the lecture, and I'm really looking forward to that as well. So Geoff and Nikki, thank you so much for doing this, and welcome to MIT, your first visit during my tenure, and hopefully not the last. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you to the department as well for hosting us, and thanks for all coming out on a Thursday evening to hear about something that we are all now intimately familiar with in some way or another over the last couple of years during COVID-19. So yeah, as Nicholas mentioned, we'll be talking, I think, relatively informally about our book, Until Proven Safe, and about our research into quarantine and lockdowns and isolation, and the spaces that result from that practice of keeping one thing separate from another, or of introducing buffers between two things to sort of engineer separation in the name of public health, and the political, psychological, and even literary or artistic implications of doing so. And so under the title Spaces of Uncertainty, we'll be going through a series of different themes, spaces, and ideas on that topic. Really briefly, I'll just say that we will be looking at, we're going to do 4 somewhat longer sort of sections going back and forth, and then we'll end the talk with kind of like a lightning round of 4 shorter ones to just continue kind of talking through different themes. And then, yeah, anything that you might want to hear more about, by all means, bring it up if there's an open Q&A at the end. So this is just an image of an individual who I'll be talking about in more detail shortly, named John Howard, who is a philanthropist who traveled throughout Europe and as far east as what is now Ukraine, in the service of exploring quarantine. And we looked at him to a certain extent as a kind of a patron saint of our book. Just again, briefly, we started looking at this topic, quarantine, all the way back in 2009. It struck both of us in terms of our individual interests as a topic that was incredibly and very excitingly interdisciplinary. When you're talking about quarantine, you're talking about the effects something might have on people psychologically. You're talking about a literary theme. You're talking about, at the time especially, there was a new movie just called Quarantine. It was a horror movie. Just the title alone was meant to inspire fear. And then, of course, it is an architectural and medical phenomenon. And so, we began to notice while we were traveling that there were, sites previously dedicated to quarantine. And quarantine, when we first started looking into it in 2009, kind of seemed like an idea that had almost run its course. We found that a lot of sites that were relevant to quarantine, were no longer dedicated to that. They'd been left to ruination. They'd been turned into hotels. They'd been turned into other kind of civic infrastructure. And all of that motivated, the first little bit here. So we're calling this the quarantine tourist. So Howard, the individual I just mentioned, was a really interesting individual. So in the late 18th century, he was independently wealthy because he inherited a bunch of money from a father who was a upholsterer in the upholstery trade. And he spent millions of, what would be the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money, just traveling around trying to understand, first, the conditions of incarceration. He was basically a prison reformer. He wanted to go around Europe and visit jails, dungeons, prisons, places where people were being held for legal or economic reasons, and analyze the conditions they were kept under to see if he could improve them. So it was things like whether they had access to sunlight, fresh air, fresh food, and those kinds of things. And he quickly realized that there was a very, very similar architectural and experiential overlap between being incarcerated and being in quarantine. And so the last bit of his life, for the last maybe 10 years or so, he became a quarantine tourist, and he started traveling around to Marseille, Genoa, Venice, Malta, and interestingly enough, actually died in the city of Kherson, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, Kherson in Ukraine, which is in the news again due to the Russian invasion. So as I mentioned earlier, we took him as a kind of patron saint, and we wanted to follow in his footsteps. We began going to places like this is outside Dubrovnik. Dubrovnik is basically the modern invention of quarantine. It's the first place where they codified in law that ships needed to wait outside the city before unloading goods or bringing crews into the city itself. And so huge, really fabulous facilities such as this were built. This is an island off the coast, very imposing walls, kind of left to ruin. It's worth noting that one of the questions of, what would a 21st century quarantine tourist visit was very, hung over the entire book and the entire research process. Quarantine, as I think we're seeing now with COVID-19, once you're out of it, and I think as we also saw with book sales, once you're out of quarantine, you don't really want to think about it. And so, it's a topic that people want to kind of sweep under the rug and move on. And I think the first thing one does when, getting out of a plague or a plague time, I should say, is putting that behind us and moving onward. But this has architectural effects. So a lot of these places were simply torn down. They were razed. A lot of quarantine facilities in the first place were built to be temporary. They were constructed from timber. In a final act of disinfection, they were often just burned to the ground. Of course, other times they were just, destroyed by modern harbor construction. And so it's an ongoing theme tonight in our lecture, I think, where we'll be looking at, where does someone go as a modern quarantine tourist? But so we had a couple questions. They were spatial questions. They were geopolitical questions. On one level, we wanted to look at the typology of quarantine. What are the spaces that result from it, and how does one build quarantine? And so the most basic way to describe a kind of the architecture of quarantine is that it's a relatively established series of courtyards where you can disinfect goods. And by disinfect at the time, because this was prior to germ theory, that simply meant airing them out. Sometimes it meant blowing aromatic breezes or incense over goods to make them smell fresh, to make them smell as if they had been disinfected, and then keeping individuals separate from one another. Of course, quarantine that we now associate, or now rather think about, as an entirely isolated, very insular experience. If you're in quarantine, you're generally speaking physically alone. You're in a room separate from your own family, separate from your department and friends. Quarantine used to be a group experience, and so there were very large, basically almost like youth hostel kind of things, large rooms with many bunks where the crew of an entire ship would be kept and then moved through a facility sequentially so that they could all leave quarantine together. There are obviously diversions or divergences rather from that typology, but I think what's interesting is that also shows that circulation is key to quarantine. It's about managing how things move through a building in a sequential order, so you're moving from danger to safety, or you're moving from possible infection to health. These kinds of practices pop up in buildings throughout our travels. Another one was the geography of quarantine. So quarantine, as I think we'll see throughout the talk tonight, also relies on geography itself. I mentioned that was an island off the coast of Dubrovnik that we saw in some previous slides. Here's Venice. Venice is a fantastic city for kind of the perfection of quarantine. If it was invented in Dubrovnik, it was perfected in Venice. Venice is already a labyrinth of islands. It's an archipelago where everything is separated by small lanes of water. And you can see, of course, how easy it would be to explore isolation as something that you can do even within different neighborhoods. It's really no coincidence, I think, that the science of quarantine, so to speak, came into its own in the same city where the ghetto was invented. Where it was as easy as basically sealing off an entire neighborhood for the Jewish population of Venice, keeping them in one location, posting guards, and making sure that people couldn't get through a locked gate or over a bridge. So it's a city that lends itself extremely well to isolation. But you'll also notice, if you look at the history of quarantine in terms of how it's inscribed in the geography of Venice, as they built new quarantine facilities, they were ever more ambitious. They were ever more interesting to see. But they were also further and further away from the city center. So geography, in and of itself became an act of quarantine, keeping things far away, this idea of the buffer or the periphery. Of course, it was also a very large civic undertaking. So at one point, this was the largest municipal building in all of Venice. This is the Lazaretto Nuovo, and which was on an island that was just falling into ruin. And it's quite interesting inside. There's a graffiti from old shipped crews that have come through, using logos of the company that they worked for, or just writing things on the walls. Just very briefly, it was also interesting that the individual who kind of rescued this place was an Italian gentleman who wanted to take over the island and turn it into a dojo and make it into a martial arts academy. And then he realized, as he said, history is more important than judo. And so now it's been preserved, and you can actually visit it as a kind of stabilized ruin. Just one more sort of overarching takeaway from our journeys. One is that sometimes you have to break into a facility in the name of architectural history. We were legally allowed to enter this place in Malta, which was one of the grandest architectural facilities constructed for quarantine. But the guy giving us a tour didn't have the appropriate keys to get past the final gates. And so you can see the sun was going down. We'd flown all the way to Malta, which, if you don't know where it is an island that is actually closer to North Africa than it is to Europe, and yet is part of the European Union, and is an extraordinarily beautiful island. But we didn't want to go all the way there without getting into this facility that we had flown there for. So we had to break in at the last minute. But what's interesting about Malta is that it was used, and one of the reasons why it was such a grand architectural facility was that it was used as a kind of outsourced border for the British Empire. And so the Brits used Malta, which was very well positioned in the Mediterranean. It's basically right at the dividing line between the west half of the Mediterranean and the eastern half. And so any ship coming from the Near East and bringing goods to Western Europe or bringing goods to Britain would have to go past Malta in some fashion. And so the Brits, who did not want to invest in quarantine and did not have a national lazaretto and did not have a national quarantine strategy, they were very committed to free trade. They did not want to put limits on goods or limit on merchants coming through the country. Decided to use Malta as a kind of outsourced place. So the facility grew and grew, and today is this really, really, really spectacular ruin. We were warned again and again before going in that basically very large sections of this place are structurally unsound and that we should avoid certain places. Of course, we didn't have our guide with us. He stayed outside so that his car didn't get towed. So the sun is going down. We're running around inside this place, kind of like catching glimpses of each other through arches. And then we realized that no one had ever told us which parts of it were structurally unsound. So it was an interesting experience from an architectural history point of view. But so these kinds of facilities then, and again, this theme, can be used geopolitically. They mark borders. They mark the outer edges of imperial ambitions or of empires. They reflect a logic of separation, of buffers, of courtyards and whatnot. But they also, this idea of the periphery of quarantine being something that happens on the edges will come up again and again tonight, because that logic has changed dramatically over time. And then just finally, John Howard himself designed what he called his ideal lazaretto. And so after he had traveled for many years, he decided that he had learned enough lessons that he put together a kind of, it's almost like a Dungeons and Dragons map of the perfect lazaretto. This is a zoom in, so you can't see all of it. But it even goes down to a large chain that could be drawn across the bay so that ships could not infiltrate the quarantine facility, but they also couldn't escape. There were gardens. It was basically kind of an early attempt at this idea of the architectural master plan as an example of public health and of the kind of ideal community. So it's quite interesting that hidden within the idea of quarantine here, you start to get this idea of almost a utopian undertaking where we can all kind of live together. We can move from danger to health, or from suspicion to clarity. And there are all of these kinds of moral themes built up in quarantine and in the architecture that frames it. So I'll leave it at that and throw it over to you for this next section.
Curiously, John Howard came up with this plan to petition the British government to invest in a quarantine facility, and finally the British government caved and said, sure, fine, and allocated some money, and an island in the Thames, in the marshes of sort of North Kent, was sort of designated for this purpose, and they began construction. And I actually visited it just earlier this year, just on a whim, and it appears that they have, we'd looked at it on Google Earth, nothing there anymore. It appears that actually the little building that did happen has now turned into been used, the masonry has been used to create a causeway to the island. So the architecture of isolation has become a bridge in its afterlife, which was kind of funny, to allow the sheep to go back and forth. But so moving on to modern day quarantine, and I think one of the things that was fascinating for us about writing this book is obviously we had toured all these historic sites of quarantine, and then suddenly COVID-19 hit. And so the question is, so now where do we do that today? And of course, you know, during the 20th century, all the grand, if not before, all the grand quarantine facilities had been decommissioned, as Geoff said, you know, transformed into something else or left to fall into ruin. And so this is, as you can probably recognize, the Javits Center. So what you get into instead of purpose-built facilities is this idea of sort of how do we flip either large facilities like this, or in an interesting twist, sort of the cookie cutter sameness of the American landscape also lends itself to being flipped. So one of the more interesting conversations we had for the book was with the head of the Army Corps of Engineers at the time, a guy called Todd Semonite, and he had, you know, within sort of days of it becoming clear that this was going to be a huge outbreak in the US, he had developed a sort of template for here's what he called small room and large room, and here's how you flip them. So he went into the Hampton Inns and the Fairfield Inns and the Econo Lodges of the world, and he developed an 8-step plan for turning them into sort of these quarantine and isolation. They were called alternate care facilities. Everything from the simple, rip out the carpet, you can't disinfect it, to the kind of clever hacking of the air conditioning system to create a negative pressure space to keep any germs inside. So, you know, and what's beautiful about that is if you've been to one Hampton Inn, you've been to them all, and you can turn them all into quarantine facilities. And similarly with the large rooms. And what was interesting to us about this flipping, I mean, as most of you know, in the end, most of these facilities weren't used. There's an economic disincentive for that. The hospitals only make money on treating patients if they're actually in the hospital. So treating them in the Javits Center is a loss leader. So it's better to have people lined up in a corridor than in the Javits Center. But what was interesting, you know, apart from hearing sort of all the same themes that we had encountered in our quarantine tours, and the idea of circulation, separation of dirty and clean, you know, diseased and healthy, etc. Apart from that, was this idea of, well, so how, if we're going to have this pop-up quarantine facility, I mean, Todd Semonite's point was, well, you know, from a military background, we're always into reserves. How do we make it so that next time we don't have to start from scratch? Is there a way to have this equipment, you know, saved, stored, serviced once a year, and then we can stand it up during the next pandemic? Is there a way to build in dual use into our facilities so that, and we're obviously not just talking pandemic here, but increasingly, you know, people who've been displaced by natural disasters, so on. Like, there are a lot of reasons why you might want pop-up facilities designed to work in this sort of way with carefully thought through circulation and ventilation that could be built into the built-in environment. So considering infection control in the initial design, I mean, his point was, you know, we are also, as taxpayers, funding these stadiums and conference centers. Could they not work for us in the case of a pandemic or disaster as well? The other thing that is, of course, interesting is that as COVID-19 happened, you know, January 2020, we're starting to get the first sort of cases popping up outside of China. That is the very moment at which the first federal quarantine in the US in more than a century, the first facility dedicated to quarantine, opened its doors. So it was incredible timing, except for this place had 20 beds. So you can imagine that immediately, you know, there were more than 20 people who needed to be quarantined. And that actually spoke to a theme that we saw again and again, which is we build for the last pandemic, always. So as we toured the facilities, around the Mediterranean, they were building for the Black Death when, cholera was the main pandemic. They were building for cholera when it was yellow fever. We were building for Ebola, not for a respiratory viral pandemic. So this is the federal quarantine facility in Omaha, Nebraska. What's fascinating too about its location is, as Geoff pointed out, in the past, we've always tried to situate quarantine on the periphery, on the edges. We've used water and geography as a sort of, and walls to separate. Nowadays, quarantine is at the center, and we use, expensive HVAC systems, security key cards, and UV reflective paint as our sort of barriers instead. But so this facility sort of gave us a sort of glimpse into the idea of how the government thought quarantine should work, and it worked really well. So for 20 people, I think in the end there were 15 people quarantined in it at the start of COVID-19. They were people who had been on one of the cruises, the Diamond Princess, and they were its inaugural guests, and they experienced sort of the ideal quarantine in many ways. They were fed, they had a psychologist on call, there are exercise bikes and treadmills in the room, obviously, your Wi-Fi, flat screen TV, food, medical care. So what was fascinating about that was also the contrast between kind of this boutique federal quarantine and then the lockdowns that the rest of us were rapidly going into, which they were not called quarantine because the government wasn't going to be there providing food and medical care and the ability to be kept separate safely, and psychological support on tap. So it was very interesting to see sort of this boutique experience, which worked exactly how the CDC wanted it to, but for 15 people, and then what the rest of the country was going through. And so where this left us was that quarantine is right now, and this is the time to be talking about this because we all still have it fresh in our minds. It is an open design challenge. It is not a thought-through experience right now. Todd Semonite, the Army Corps of Engineers, was talking to us about, these centralized facilities are one thing, but could you get people a kit so that they could separate in their own homes? For people who were living in crowded housing, multi-generational homes, the spread of COVID in those homes was incredible. He was like, well, what about those paint zippers you use at Home Depot? Can we come up with a sort of set of parts, the same way he came up with a template for flipping Marriott hotel rooms, to flip the average American interior so that quarantine can happen at home in a much safer and more useful way? What are the resources that need to go with that? And I end with this picture because it's, traditionally when people have infectious diseases or are suspected of having infectious diseases, medical practitioners will protect themselves by wearing PPE. And that is very dehumanizing. People find it, medical professionals find it difficult to wear. People who are being cared for then, can't see people. And so there's this doctor he's a Congolese doctor who came up with this sort of alternate system called a care cube, and where the medical worker sort of inserts themselves into the plastic wall. What it means is you don't need special training to put on that PPE. So family members can also kind of put themselves into the plastic wall. You can, the person is in there, can see out, can, receive a hug. You can see they have these kind of openings in the wall. And it was just a really interesting example of this is how, thinking about the experience of the person in quarantine can lead you to design it completely differently. There's more than one way to keep ourselves safe. And can we provide this this barrier of quarantine without all the isolation and fear and inequality that goes with it, or has gone with it to date?
So I swallowed wrong. As soon as you finished, I'm sorry. So one of the interesting things about quarantine is, as well, excuse me, yeah, I swallowed wrong, it's not COVID, was that it obviously applies to not just the human world, so it also applies to plants and animals. And one thing we wanted to do with the book as well is look at the application and use of quarantine as a way of kind of managing the borders of the human experience, of managing what it means to be human and to interact with an inhuman world, or even, as Nikki will talk about in a forthcoming session, even with an alien world, with potential extraterrestrial organisms. But here on Earth, one of the things that was interesting to explore was state border plant quarantine inspection stations. And so this is an old photograph by Dorothea Lange, but we got to visit as part of the book where fruits and vegetables are brought into the state of California where we live, and are treated basically as a kind of potential threat to the entire state economy. It's a very, very, it's where most of the country's vegetables are grown. It's a very unique ecosystem, and keeping things out that are potential contaminants or potential infectious vectors is obviously very important, and there's an entire quarantine infrastructure around that. But rather than get into the California state inspection, I wanted to look at a couple other sites that we found pretty fascinating. So this is in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a USDA plant disease research facility, and they're specifically researching a really ominous pathogen, which is it's known as wheat rust. There's actually a really great novel called The Death of Grass that is about what would happen. It's kind of a dystopian science fiction novel about what would happen if one of these types of diseases, a rust disease, started spreading around the world, from bread baskets from Central Asia to Africa to North and South America. And it has the potential, of course, to wipe out all of the grass species, these kinds of diseases. And so that includes wheat. It includes a lot of plants that go into our food supply, which would lead to global famine and unbelievably catastrophic effects on human life, let alone natural ecosystems. And so this place was a fantastic place to experience isolation and quarantine. So even just to get in, you have to remove all of your clothing. You have to shower, get into a Tyvek suit, wearing nothing at all beneath. In fact, I guess you were technically allowed to wear underwear, but you can't bring it out. It was a great example of the control that quarantine has over goods and people, because you couldn't, if you took notes on paper, the paper couldn't leave. So anything you brought in would be stuck in there. It would be autoclaved and thus destroyed, or they would take a digital photo and email you a JPEG of the notes that you had just taken. And so we found these kinds of extreme controls over entry and exit, throughout the world of quarantine and throughout the control of quarantine architecture and quarantine infrastructure and logistics. And here, you see it's a kind of a maze of interiors within interiors. So some of these plants that do in fact have wheat rust, are kept sealed, even within rooms that are themselves sealed and under negative pressure, which are in facilities that are also sealed, and then you're walking around in a Tyvek suit. So it's very much about the controlling exposure. One interesting detail about this is that quarantine, for the most part, is never 100% effective, or rather 100% foolproof. It can still work even if it's leaky, because you still slow down the rate of infection and you slow down the amount that something can actually, a disease or a pathogen can spread through a community. But in this case, one of the fears was that the quarantine would be upended by the fact that it's on the University of Minnesota campus. And the specific fear, which I love this act of imagination, was that an overly strong javelin thrower on a track and field team would throw a javelin from the nearby track practice facility, which is literally just outside, and the javelin would pierce the outside shell, and you would have the virulent release of a pathogen that could destroy all of North American agriculture and potentially spread around the world. Another interesting detail is that the state of Minnesota itself was considered kind of a quarantine barrier. The winters are so harsh that they only work with these pathogens during the winter, so that if there is a release, the pathogens would freeze or would not be able to spread or get into blooming plants that are going up to harvest. So again, the choice, the physical geographic location of these facilities, I think is a very important detail. Another place in terms of plant and animal quarantine that we went to was the International Cocoa Quarantine Facility. This is actually outside London in England, and this gentleman here is basically the man that stands between us and what's now known as the chalk-pocalypse. So it is actually it's a realistic scenario that we might lose chocolate as a commodity in the future. It's a very, very monocultured plant, and also it's very, very subject to these plant diseases that can easily jump from one to the next. And so if you want to move cocoa plants around the world, they have to go through Reading, England, which again is chosen like Minnesota because it's so rainy and so gray that any of these, and there aren't cocoa plants growing in the wild in England, that if something were to escape, it wouldn't be able to infect a larger ecosystem. And so if you're moving plants from, say, Southeast Asia to Central Africa, or Central Africa to South America, they have to go through England, and they're watched for up to 3 years. There's a very compelling and strange kind of choreography to how these plants are moved and watched and grafted and studied to make sure that they're not infected before they pass on. But it's this kind of, just the everyday structures of massively important logistical control like this, so that it just looks like this. You wouldn't even necessarily cast a second eye at it. It's not very architecturally compelling, and yet it plays an outsized important role in terms of the global chocolate industry or commodity exchange. And yet also it gets even more important. Chocolate is one thing, but when you're talking about much larger economic stakes in terms of commodities, in terms of the food supply, we also then got back to the center of the United States here. This is a brand new facility. It was just opened. It's in Manhattan, Kansas. It's known as the Little Apple. It's actually a trademarked phrase. And architecturally, this place is quite fascinating. They put a lot of time and energy into making sure that it was LEED certified. The gentleman who we met, who was on the engineering team in terms of figuring out how to build it and how to make it better for the animals that would be studied here, also pointed out that it's allegedly it can withstand a Category 5 tornado. So the strongest possible tornado. After all, it is Kansas. We've presumably some of us at least have seen The Wizard of Oz. A tornado will very likely come through here at some point, and supposedly this facility can resist that, even though it's got these very large panes of glass and very large windows. But that would be another example of how quarantine could potentially fail. But then also he paid enough attention that when we met with him here, he was describing how he needed to re-engineer the flooring surfaces inside, because when they bring in cattle and they bring in other animals that are hooved, hooves can slip on floors like the ones that here in the facility, and yet if you put too much grit or too much texture on the floors, it can actually damage the hooves and hurt the animals and negatively affect their hooves.
Plus, you can't disinfect them.
Yeah, plus it's harder to disinfect. And so he spent a long time adding just the right amount of grit to a new flooring system that he wants to have. It actually is going to become a new international standard. But to test it, he actually got a cow leg from a nearby, I guess it was part of the research lab. He attached it to a walking mechanism that you would use to test footfall for like shoe design or medical prostheses. And then in his basement, almost like a deleted scene from the Dahmer documentary, he just had this this detached foot endlessly walking on new flooring systems in his basement. And I guess, according to him, at least his wife was not a big fan of this. But I think there was just one more thing I wanted to say about that. Yeah, so the other interesting thing about this is that, first of all, this is yet another example of how quarantine, in this case, this facility is actually replacing one that was on the tip of Long Island. And so once again, you're seeing this idea of an island research facility that was using the waters around it and an insular nature of being on an island as a natural form of quarantine. Now it's in the very center of the country, and in fact, ironically, it's surrounded exactly by US cattle country. And so it's almost, you could argue, in the most dangerous place you could possibly put it. In fact, they had former Navy SEALs come through and do a security audit who made certain recommendations about how to redesign the building, how to change things. But then as we spoke to them in more detail, it turned out that actually even county sheriffs now have developed their own quarantine plans, so that if there is a release of a pathogen that could wipe out the herd stock for the United States, There's actually specific roads that they know they'll have to put up roadblocks, concrete blocks, armed guards, et cetera. But so there is a very sort of, there's a latent quarantine plan ready for these kinds of facilities. And being a pessimist, I'd say that I'm all but guarantee these kinds of plans will be put to the test. It's just a question of when and whether or not it will be tornado-based or some other kind of leak.
So one of the things that was so interesting about the second half of the book was that we were looking at quarantine, as Geoff has said, in sort of some of these different contexts. You know, I think we all now think about quarantine in relation to humans. It was obviously invented for that. But like when you look at it in these different contexts, you can see different truths about its internal logic. So for plant and animal quarantine, one of the things that becomes immediately evident is how much of an economic logic lies in quarantine, and the things that are considered worth quarantining, things that are considered, you know, worth protecting in that way. When you look at planetary protection, you know, you start to understand that really quarantine is about de-risking situations of complete uncertainty, trying to manage that just in some, you know, trying to create some infrastructural framework around existential uncertainty. And so planetary quarantine emerged in the 1950s when it became clear that you know, the distances between, you know, our celestial neighbors were no longer going to be their own form of quarantine, because we were going to be able to traverse them in rockets. And actually, fascinatingly, it was an American idea, and it came out of the sense that the European invasion and colonization of the Americas had been so microbiologically devastating that we should maybe try not to do that again with outer space. And so there was this idea that, you know, literally the quote was, we're in a better position than Columbus to have our cake and eat it. So that is the origins of planetary quarantine, which was originally called planetary quarantine, is now called planetary protection, and there is a planetary protection officer in Washington, D.C., whose job is to protect the planet, and actually not just protect us from outer space, but really primarily protect outer space from us. And of course, this is like an incredibly abstract idea. I mean, the uncertainties, you know, when COVID started, we didn't know anything about it. You know, how was it transmitted? You know, who was most susceptible? What was most effective? We don't know if there is alien life, if it could be possibly dangerous to us, or we could be dangerous to it. And if so, what form of separation would possibly make the most sense? So it is a gigantic sort of abstract exercise in, okay, how do we think about this? And there's an incredible sort of algorithmic process by which the spacefaring nations arrived at an acceptable way of calculating risk and then dividing it amongst themselves. And we, for example, here in the US have been using some percentage of that acceptable risk on every robotic mission since. So we're sort of chipping away at our allowable contamination, as it were. But it became, and that's called forward contamination, us sort of contaminating space. Back contamination sort of became the perhaps first and most sort of intensive form of quarantine in as far as NASA was concerned. And they were somewhat surprised by this. They're busy planning to put a man on the moon, racing to do so. And the CDC surprises everyone by saying, well, we're not going to allow entry into the United States to these astronauts unless you quarantine them. Like, you can't prove that there's no life, no dangerous life on the moon, and therefore we, as the CDC, cannot allow these astronauts back into the US. So it was like, oops, we better scramble and develop a quarantine process. Part of that involved a modified Airstream trailer, the mobile quarantine facility, which these, you're seeing Nixon greeting the astronauts on it. They were immediately put into this after being sort of rescued from their little pod in the Pacific, and it did have all kinds of entertainments and amusements. It had, at the time, what was a very newfangled microwave with ready meals they could heat up, including Eggs Benedict, which apparently exploded in the microwave, as one might predict, as well as alcohol. So it's a good time was had by all. That airstream, after 3 days, made it to Houston, and incredibly, in the Federal Register, a quarantine was established to protect against extraterrestrial exposure. So this is in the Federal Register. For a brief period, America was officially under quarantine for extraterrestrial exposure. The plan, in fact, for the lunar receiving lab, which was then constructed, was if any alien life had been detected, was to simply bury the entire facility under rock and dirt. Technicians had to sign a form saying their families would not try to claim the bodies. Everyone was going to just be buried alive. So that was the backup plan. And while the astronauts were being, kept in their part of the lab, there was also the question of, okay, so how do we prove them safe? Because that's quarantine. It's until proven safe. So that is where the entire sort of the largest part of the facility comes into play. And NASA came up with a protocol where essentially they would sort of challenge various living organisms with lunar materials and see how they responded. So they selected a variety of organisms. They tested them with ground up bits of moon rock. Apparently the shrimp became more aggressive. The oysters died. The crops in general grew a lot better, which NASA suddenly got excited, like maybe this is the future of fertilizer. But after 15 days, it was sort of determined that the lunar materials were safe, et cetera, and after a couple more Apollo missions, lunar quarantine was abolished. But one of the interesting things about this sort of idea of sample return in particular is that you're looking at sort of twofold quarantine. You're actually not only trying to keep this stuff from contact with Earth, you're also trying to stop Earth from having contact with it. So it's a curatorial challenge that you don't normally see. There's both positive and negative pressure kind of being used at the same time. And these today, now that we are sort of past the lunar quarantine days, the lunar rocks are simply protected from Earth rather than the other way around. So. But what's interesting about this is this all seems like distant past, etc., but it's actually a huge design challenge underway right now for the return of samples from Mars. And that facility remains to be designed. In fact, it's going to be a lot more complicated probably than the lunar receiving lab, because several nations are going to be involved. So where is it? Do you have to have a quarantine chain connecting multiple labs on different continents? Because the European Space Agency is involved in returning these samples, as well as this is Percy, the rover that is collecting the samples. So all of that, and then that's not just a site selection and a facility design question and a sort of quarantine logistics chain. It's also an approval process. Who says, does the European Union or does the US Fish and Wildlife say that this is safe to take out? So this entire process is, underway at the moment. What should this facility look like? Who gets to say what's safe in this situation? I think, it's a global, thinking about quarantine at that level is, it's sort of stakes suddenly become sort of much larger.
All right, so now we're going to start, sort of the lightning round, just sort of a couple more takeaways from our research into quarantine from the book. One of the things that has been really, really interesting over the last couple of years has been the rise of what we're calling here algorithmic smart home quarantine. The image that you're looking at is from a patent that Amazon filed that was for the ability of its always-on smart speaker system to recognize the sounds of potential infection in an owner, so that if you sound like you might have a cold, or for that matter, COVID-19, it can not only register that, but then it can recommend an economic solution. If it notices that you are coughing, it can recommend, say, cough drops. If it notices that you sound a little depressed or down because maybe you've been home too much and you're sick, it'll try to steer you toward maybe streaming your favorite films. There are some really interesting privacy issues associated with that, of course. The idea that not only they have access to that, but they might try to counter depression with commercial recommendations is quite sinister. But these kinds of things are really kind of just the tip of the iceberg. So we are seeing in architecture the transformation of the built environment into a kind of diagnostic device. We're first seeing this in terms of assisted living facilities, where new construction has for the elderly have sensors in everything. So there can be sensors in the floor to see if you've fallen. There can be color sensors in the mirror to see if your skin tone has changed, which might indicate a cardiac problem or perhaps even a stroke. There are microphones throughout your house that might pick up the sound of someone coughing. And those kinds of things can be not only registered, but in the case of an assisted living facility, might result in someone coming in to see if you're okay. But if it's in the context of where, say, Google, who owns Nest, which has a home thermostat company, or rather makes home thermostats as well as the front door locks that you might have on your home, you get into a potentially very ominous scenario where these kinds of decisions about who is quarantined or who is isolated are made algorithmically, automatically, and outside of human intervention entirely. So if you fit the bill, maybe you're cranking your home thermostat, maybe you've been Googling the symptoms of COVID-23, and so on and so forth, your house itself could make the decision to not let you unlock the door that day. It might even be connected to whether or not you can show a proof of vaccination, which here in Massachusetts appears to be the case at certain restaurants, and is certainly true in Los Angeles where we live. So perhaps you have to show proof of vaccination to leave your own house. These kinds of questions, I think, are not futuristic at all. They're actually basically already happening in terms of access to public infrastructure, access to subways in places in China. And so these kinds of things are only going to pick up pace.
One of the reasons that's interesting is that because if you look at the history of quarantine, the ways that it has constrained mobility have actually sort of inscribed themselves into the infrastructure that shapes mobility still. So it is absolutely not ridiculous at all to be concerned that the constraints on mobility and like additional surveillance and so on created during COVID-19 would then carry on to structure our lives afterwards, because that is exactly what has happened in the past. So this is a quarantine corridor, 1,000-mile quarantine corridor built on the edges of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was there for 100 years, essentially, 1770 to 1871. And this was a sort of epidemiological boundary at the edge of Europe, sort of separating Europe from its eastern neighbors. It's an astonishing structure at the time. There were thousands of guard towers. You were never out of musket shot range of a guard tower. The people who lived in this buffer zone, which wasn't just a wall, it was a 30-mile wide buffer zone, they were peasants, but then also had to serve 1 week every couple months on the quarantine line. And what's fascinating is that this has ended up sort of structuring, life there to this day. Researchers who went there in 2019 found that people who live in this quarantine buffer zone, still are poorer, have lower levels of trust, higher rates of bribery. I mean, it's left its sort of legacy on the landscape. It's also left a cultural legacy, which is fascinating. This was ground zero for vampire sightings, leading up to, of course, Dracula in the 1890s. So this sort of zone of suspicion and uncertainty and liminality sort of became the origin point for vampire myths for Europe. But the larger point that we get into in the book is that quarantine just sort of has ended up shaping borders, inspiring the paperwork with which we cross those borders. The first passports were health passports. It led to the formation of the institutions of global governments that still shape mobility and trade. You know, the UN finds its origins in quarantine conventions. And so thinking now about what infrastructure we've put in place during COVID-19 and how that will continue to shape our lives as we go forward is incredibly important. Oh, and the reason why is because quarantine, despite actually in some ways, in some circumstances, being one of our most effective tools to slow the spread of a novel disease, has an equally long history of abuse. The thing about quarantine that is so interesting is it's one of the few instances where you are essentially guilty until proven innocent. You're dangerous until proven safe. And many, many times that judgment is made on suspicion. It's based on uncertainty, and that is where suspicion and bias comes in. And so it has a long history of kind of giving a sort of seemingly scientific endorsement to what is basically just bias and prejudice. And so one of the things was interesting when COVID-19 happened is everyone was looking back to the 1918 flu and saying, oh, that was our last major quarantine. But actually, at the same time, was one of our least known quarantines, something called the American Plan, under which tens of thousands of women were locked up under suspicion of having venereal disease, having and spreading venereal disease. And there's an amazing book about this. This whole history was sort of dug up by a Yale law student. The book's called The Trials of Nina McCall. But women could be quarantined under sort of reasonable suspicion of having venereal disease. But then when you read the papers, reasonable suspicion turns out to be they dined alone at a restaurant. They were, they quit their job and went somewhere else, and their boss wanted revenge. They were late on their rent. For example, in Kansas, where 30% of the women who were locked up under the American Plan were black, clearly they were just the wrong skin color. That was the suspicious part. So it's a sort of really, the principles of quarantine are easily abused, and building in sort of guarantees to avoid that. This is one of the quarantine notices is also an incredibly important part of saying, if we want to use this tool, we have to use it correctly.
And then finally, we just wanted to look at kind of the outer limits of quarantine. What's interesting about quarantine is where it shades off into isolation. So it's possibly too long of a topic to get into, but isolation is different from quarantine in that it's a known dangerous substance or dangerous person. So they've been isolated, as opposed to quarantine, which is about uncertainty. You might be a threat, or you might be infected, or you might be dangerous. And so we wanted to look at a really extraordinary facility that is called WIP. It's the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's an underground salt mine being dug by the Department of Energy in New Mexico, and it's 2,100 feet below ground, and this is where we're storing low-level nuclear waste. It's an unbelievably strange and quite eerie facility that we could go into more detail, but just the takeaway here will be that it's carved out of salt. Salt is a natural barrier for radiation, but it's also very malleable. I compare it to a marshmallow, and when it's under that much strain from all of the land above, it bulges inward. And so if you look closely, you'll notice that there are rock nets and bolts that are holding the salt in place. You can hold a light up to it, and your light will go into the salt walls. It's a very dreamlike facility. But one of the things that they do for this is that even though it's radioactive waste that is being, some of these half-lives exceed millions of years, and the federal government actually mandates that it has to be kept safe, in some cases for 1 million years. as if there are going to be U.S. government inspectors 1 million years from now actually checking to see if the facility was built correctly. But it's constructed in a kind of just-in-time manner. So the logistics of getting nuclear waste to New Mexico rely on a series of truck networks that are bringing this waste to the facility. And they carve new hallways and corridors that are known as drifts. So they'll carve new drifts into the salt. And these places are absolutely enormous. When you're driving on a cart underground, it's just roaring with ventilation, and it can be minutes and minutes and minutes before you even see the next room, let alone get to the next part of the facility. But so as the walls are crushing in like marshmallow, then the nuclear waste arrives, they put it in, and then the salt, that compaction is actually part of the design process. And so the facility swells down and closes like a wound around the nuclear waste and kind of seals it in place. And so there's a really interesting kind of time difference between the idea of just-in-time excavation and the eternal isolation of a dangerous material that WIP kind of represents. And so, and goes to show some of not only just the temporal scales of quarantine, but the spatial scales of quarantine, and the technical challenge of trying to isolate and keep things separate from one another. And so, we'll leave it at that and then go into a Q&A. But thanks for listening, and thanks for coming out. Whip back up. Hey.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicola and Geoff, for coming out and giving this fascinating transhistorical survey of quarantine and leading us or giving us a glimpse of these unexpected built environments. I guess as I was, is everything working all right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. As we were, taking this journey with you, I was immediately curious about the place you found yourselves to be in spring 2020, when you were several years, engaged in this quarantine project, and perhaps in a sort of Cassandra-like position, recognizing, having this terrible recognition of these tropes of quarantine, the centers of isolation, the kind of neurotic desire to disinfect absolutely everything that passed, this attempts to have control over the spaces around us by disinfecting everything, health passports. What surprised you during that time, since you had this foreknowledge, perhaps, that a lot of us lacked?
I mean, it was. I guess I was most surprised by the fact that we did all know this was coming. At least the people whose job it was to prepare for it knew it was coming. And we had just been, in October 2019 at a pandemic simulation for a novel coronavirus. In the simulation, I think it was first discovered in Brazil, not China. But the head of the Chinese CDC was at this simulation, playing one of the the characters in the simulation, and so it was not a surprise. And yet, there was an incredible sort of unwillingness to recognize exactly how much of a threat it was, and to do the things that people had been planning and simulating and thinking about. Even, we had many conversations with the head of the CDC's quarantine division over the years. This is something he'd been thinking about for, 25 years. He had reformed quarantine law. He had, tried to think through the ethics of quarantine very carefully. He had analyzed the 1918 flu. He's the guy who came up with the expression "flatten the curve," to see what worked and didn't work. And yet still, when it came to actually implementing any of these measures, everyone was just like, we're really going to do this? And so it was just sort of the paralysis was kind of fascinating to me. What about you?
Yeah, no, but I mean, I would second all that, and I'd say also just how frustrating it was to watch some of the mistakes that we had seen in our research being made all over again. And I think some of that comes down to one of the themes that we kind of talked about in the very beginning, which was there's kind of an amnesia built into the plague experience, and in particular the quarantine experience. Because even though a book about quarantine can be very, very interesting, the experience of quarantine, is almost legendarily boring. I mean, the whole point is that you just have to sit in a building long enough to demonstrate that you aren't infected with a certain disease. And if it's an ad hoc experience, you might not even have anything to do. You might not be there with books or with even games or even with people to talk to. My point is that we so quickly forget the things that we've been through, and we take down or we tear down quarantine facilities that we might have or other people might have experienced in the past. That when this does pop up, there aren't a lot of guide rails to follow, and so or guardrails rather. And so you've got people like Marty Citron at the CDC who was warning that this is the kind of thing that's going to happen, and that we have to be prepared for it. But you're doing that in a very amnesiac environment. So I thought that was one of the things that was most frustrating about watching COVID unfold. It just seemed so obvious that this kind of thing was going to happen.
Oh, that's, I mean, a bit of a tragic place to find yourselves, in some capacity, but also an interesting one, certainly.
Definitely,
Yeah.
And I guess you propose in this presentation in your book some of the heuristics for doing quarantine better that perhaps we can adopt in the case of a future pandemic. But I was also intrigued by what we can learn from these liminal spaces of quarantine, not only for pathogens that affect humans, but the ones you explored involving biological threats or botanical threats to plants, these sort of facilities for managing nuclear waste, and particularly this infrastructure of contingency that's in some ways quite invisible to us. To me, felt related to some of the problems we're looking at, I guess in the design community, largely around climate resilience. And I was wondering if that was something you've been thinking about, especially as you've been examining the protocols, the aesthetics of these strange places.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, it's about acceptable risk, but then, there's a value judgment built into that. And who gets to decide what acceptable risk is. There's definitely an economic value question that was always evident with agricultural quarantine in particular, but also with planetary protection. I mean, it was essentially, we'll do as much protection as we can to fit within our national space budget so we can still do the exploring we want to do. So there's always an economic question. And those are exactly the questions that are coming up with climate resilience projects is, well, what's economically worth protecting? What's acceptable risk, and who for? What do we think is worth protecting? The kind of fascinating thing as well with agricultural quarantine is it's always sort of a decay process. So you are really just buying time. The diseases will come into, for example, California anyway. What you're trying to do is slow it, and so there's sort of this process of quarantine decay where you just sort of eventually abandon the attempt to keep out a certain pathogen and move on to the next one. And that again is sort of something that you see in the kind of conversation about how we should design climate resilience is when do we retreat, So there are all those sorts of things built in.
I think one thing that was kind of interesting as well that maybe doesn't touch as much on climate change, but just that I think was, what could be learned from the spaces of quarantine from both everything from the plants and animals to everyday life for isolating people due to COVID-19 was just actually ironically just how not on a medical level, but on a conceptual level, how close the built environment that we've already constructed is to a state of quarantine. I think that one of the things that was so funny in Los Angeles, where we live again, is that, maintaining isolation from other people, not interacting with them, staying alone in your house or apartment, is all but a description of everyday life in the city of Los Angeles. And so I think that one of the things that was came up again and again in the COVID-19 pandemic, and I guess is still ongoing, but is coming up less, is that for a lot of people that just made a life that they had chosen to live, which didn't differ all that much from how they had to live under COVID-19. Like you could binge watch things on Netflix, you could order a lot of things on Amazon, you could spend a lot of time alone, became unbearable when it was the only decision, when it was the only thing that you could do. And I think that for a lot of people, it kind of led to a crisis of significance. And we had a lot of friends who left LA, who quit their jobs, who moved into totally different industries.
Got divorced.
Who got divorced, who just all but just completely changed their kind of romantic arrangements. And I think that that was something that stood out just in terms of that we already have a built environment that is quite well suited for isolation, keeping people apart, preventing interaction. It's almost like in the city of Venice, how we mentioned that the city is a perfect laboratory for finding new ways to isolate people. But I think a lot of the Western urbanism is like that, and it may not be perfect for preventing a respiratory illness from spreading. But if it was mass Ebola, that type of thing, a different disease with a different vector, I think we'd find that we've constructed such an atomized world that it is kind of a world of quarantine. And so that was an interesting takeaway in terms of exploring these places.
Oh, yeah, thank you. No, that's a thought-provoking response. I guess at this point, I'll open it up to the audience if there are any questions. Nicholas, I guess there's a microphone set up.
Is this on? Yeah, perfect. So here we are. It's a lovely lecture, and there's some lovely people here. We did have the new MIT president announced today, and a couple of other things going on. So I'm not going to blame it all of the audience scale all on the subject of quarantine, but I think it's also an interesting thing to talk about, as we were before, that you invested a decade of your life in thinking about something that people now kind of don't want to think about, and I remember having a conversation with you early in the pandemic, and I was like, wow, what are the odds that we'd be facing the first global, truly global pandemic since the not Spanish flu, and isn't it interesting and timely, and yet there's something about being timely here that's also putting into tying into discomfort and people's lack of desire to deal with the kind of spatial and political realities of what we've all just have a kind of PTSD around. And so just to name that and then ask you the next question, which is, as sort of experts in how these narratives have changed over time and sort of time travelers from these pandemics past into the present, what have you learned about how to keep conversations alive and how to talk about uncomfortable things in between uncomfortable moments, and what are your kind of lessons, and where do you find openings to have these conversations right now that we might learn from?
Well, yeah, first of all, yeah, it's an astute observation and a frustrating reality, to see that people aren't necessarily interested in a topic that is so fascinating. But I think that keeping the conversation alive, I do find that the minute you talk about COVID-19 or you talk about vaccination or those kinds of things, people's eyes glaze over, and it's more or less like the conversation's over. Unless you're a conspiracy theorist and you want to try to get down to exactly what room it leaked from. But I find that these kinds of themes are just so omnipresent throughout human culture and mythology and literature. You can find themes of quarantine throughout literary history, throughout mythological history. An example we use in the book is this really great example called Alexander's Gates, which was a rumored structure built somewhere east of Europe by Alexander the Great's armies as they were conquering Central Asia. And it's an incredible metaphor, because what it was basically that Alexander the Great's men welded together a huge iron structure that literally demarcated the civilized West from the monstrous East. And it was actually so prevalent a myth that it actually began to appear on world maps at the time as if it was a real thing, but it was a metaphor. It's a racist metaphor, it's an imperialistic metaphor, it's a geographic one. But I think that those kinds of things, if you can find those, and I think the book abounds with those kinds of things, you can really show how quarantine, isolation, separation, buffering, othering, all of these things are absolutely integral, even I'd say, to the human psyche. And I think quarantine becomes such an interesting metaphor that if you keep the conversation on that and don't talk about COVID-19, I think that's a good way or rather, I think it's a better way to have a conversation with people about these topics. And that's one of the reasons why, the second half of the book, goes into, plant and animal quarantine and all of the things that we might not know about it. Geological quarantine from moon rocks to nuclear waste, which in that case is isolation. But, all of those, that's the way that I would say that you can keep a subject alive without it being cursed with timeliness. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it was funny, there was because Nikki's originally British, and today the Prime Minister of Britain resigned. And it was funny because there's an individual who wrote a book that was about Liz, her name is Liz Truss. Liz Truss and her astonishing rise to power, I've written the book and it comes out just in time for Christmas. And, so on Twitter, on social media, people, and this guy tweeted this like 2 weeks ago. They were like, wouldn't want to be him. And it was just kind of funny that if you, there's also just that the illusion of a timely book inevitably seems like it's already out of date, because how on earth could this book be accurate when the thing is still ongoing? So a book about the COVID-19 vaccine, for example, seems like, it's still, variants are still spiraling around, conspiracy theories have exploded. How could you possibly write an up-to-date book about the vaccine? And so those kinds of questions, I think, are just journalistic and editorial questions, but yeah.
I also think it has partly to do, at least in the US, with a certain sense of shame, like we did not do a very good job here, and we're not willing to look at why we didn't, because that would involve looking at like enormous structural inequalities in how we organize our society. So I do feel like it seems as though countries that did slightly better have had better conversations about, or at least some conversations, if not better conversations, about what are we going to do, do we want to maintain this infrastructure for next time? Australia built quarantine facilities. Do we want to keep those at least functional, which has a cost associated with it, because they might be useful in other circumstances, because they might be useful for the next pandemic? Were they fit for purpose this time around, So I feel like, in part in the US, it's because we have nothing really to pat ourselves on the back for here. We kind of had the worst of all possible worlds, where we locked down and we still managed to have, almost as if we didn't. That I think that it's particularly difficult for people to want to have a conversation about it. But it is funny because, midway through the pandemic, everyone was like, wow, our society, we can never go back to living the same way again. We've all changed. We will never, and it felt as though people were like, we'll come out of this different and better. And I just, somewhere along the line, that gets lost. But every time throughout history. So
I find really briefly, just to extend that briefly, I find that just through casual, so this is anecdata, but through talking to people about things, I feel like other narratives are already coming in to mask the COVID experience. And so, I've had experience or conversations recently about, the crime wave that is going through American cities, the alleged crime wave, which I feel like when you're talking about whether or not like the downtown is a ghost town, well, a lot of that is actually because of COVID-19 lockdowns. It's because of the effects of the coronavirus. It's because of the economic knock-ons, et cetera, of people moved. New York City was, everybody bought cars and left. So you've got, there have been urban changes and economic changes and cultural, social changes. But there's already a new narrative coming in which doesn't have any room for COVID, and it's just that there's this spike in murders. It's about gun violence, and there's nothing that leads up to that. So I feel like there's already a kind of an amnesiac meta-narrative coming in, and it would be, one of the things that also came out that was interesting in the research was that how forgotten the Spanish flu pandemic was until it was actually, sort of rescued from newspaper archives by some of these researchers who we spoke to for the book, who were looking back at what happened during that time period. It was just forgotten in terms of economic collapse, World War I, the rise of fascism into World War II. And I think that entire time period, the pandemic disappeared. And it honestly feels like that's happening in real time now. It seems unbelievable to suggest that we would forget COVID-19. But the idea that it had an effect on downtowns, I think, is already, and anecdotally, happening in terms of talking to people and why cities have shifted. So it's already kind of an interesting problem.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you for your talk. I feel like you're kind of describing maybe a disjuncture between like the
At the bottom. But I think it was on before.
Maybe it was, yeah.
okay. It's lit up now. Okay. Is it good? Okay. There's a disjuncture, I think, between kind of the architecture that you're showing, which is kind of, bland, nondescript, like maybe strange, maybe beautiful, like the early lazarettos you showed, but kind of the seriousness of what needs to be communicated. And I think that gets really interesting when we're talking, about 1 million years in the future. Like, there's not going to be, I don't think there will be people reading, the road signs in English there. So I wonder, like, what potential you see for architecture to come in and kind of bridge that gap?
Sure. Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the specific image behind me here, I mean, it's kind of a legendary semiotic challenge, which is to communicate risk and danger to future generations. And so the DOE, in a really fascinating kind of design charrette, actually brought together anthropologists, linguists, semioticians, even religious scholars, to ask the question of how you would communicate risk to future generations. And so, there are incredible attempts to get rid of the idea of signage and replace it with architecture that could communicate menace. And so instantly you get into what I think is a pretty obviously flawed design challenge, which is that some of the silly responses I think show just how difficult it would be to do that. So one of my favorite examples was that somewhat inexplicably, someone on this design committee thought that Edvard Munch's painting *The Scream*, which if you've ever seen the poster for Home Alone, the Macaulay Culkin film, where he's screaming, it's kind of a parody of this painting. But the idea was that it's such a traumatic and menacing painting that if we just had that reproduced throughout the site in New Mexico, that for tens of thousands of years, people will just be so freaked out they'll leave. Because that will communicate danger, which is idiotic. And also, I mean, now that's like a popular refrigerator magnet because obviously people are not traumatized by looking at it. But in any case, those kinds of questions I think are very real and very unsolved. And I think that there is definitely an undercurrent of people in the DOE and in the radioactive waste community that simply think you shouldn't sign it at all. Just bury it, make it as physically inaccessible as possible, and leave. Because it's the idea that you would actually inadvertently go 2,150 feet below the surface of the Earth into a salt bed to try to dig something out, that the logistical challenge is quite high. Of course, it's also in the middle of fracking country, and so there's a lot of problems there. You can actually see on a map that all of the wells are getting closer and closer to WIP, and so there's a visible line of where they stop, so you can see this gigantic square in satellite images. But in any case, that's a long-winded answer, but because it's a problem with quarantine. Previous to this, I wrote a book about burglary and architecture, and it was interesting while studying the history of quarantine, and that there's also an overlap with burglary because if you warn people about the potential infectiousness of a building, or that this building is dangerous, this family might be infected, or this building itself might have a pathogen in it, other people, more entrepreneurial kinds of people would say, well, wait a minute, that means that either there's no one there, or maybe I'm immune, I recovered from the disease. And so they actually would use it as a targeting system. And so there were a lot of gangs of burglars in Mediterranean Europe who would actually target sites that had been specifically signed, basically do not enter. But for other people, that's an invitation to go in. And in fact, actually some minor outbreaks resulted in people taking things from quarantine facilities, from quarantined houses, et cetera. But I don't necessarily know if I'm answering the question in terms of how architecture can address that. But I feel like you see it with set design and concept art and films and TV. How do you make Mordor look menacing in the Lord of the Rings movies? Or how do you make the enemy castle, or look atmospheric and foreboding? But I feel like, again, if you did that and it was a site of nuclear waste, people are still going to go there. Really creepy castles in the Carpathians are tourist sites now. They don't keep people out. So I personally think it's an impossible challenge. You can't do that. You have to just result on brute force physical barriers, and even then that won't work, because we'll come up with some new system to nuke our way through, or we'll have a laser-powered drilling apparatus, or there's just no way to stop people from doing it. So I think amnesia is the way forward, not memory.
But I think to the larger point of what should quarantine look like. I mean, for example, thinking about how architects could address thinking about a more humane quarantine experience in the future. I feel like part of the problem is that it's precisely not monumental. We're talking about small kind of insertions into the built environment that make it work better. And I think it's a fascinating challenge. I mean, one of the funny things about the book is when we were researching it, was actually we have to find someone who's experienced quarantine to learn from them. And then of course everyone but we were writing this obviously for a long time before COVID-19, so we tracked down someone who'd experienced quarantine and with great thrill and asked him. But I think his answers bear thinking about, because his point was, when you are in quarantine, it can feel like an experience that is lacking in meaning and that is isolating. And yet, you are doing it for your community. It is the most community-centric act you can do. And why doesn't it feel like that? Well, that to me is a design failure. Why have we not thought about a way to make this most the most kind of social, pro-social thing you could do feel like an act of connection rather than an act of dislocation. And so I don't think that, that's not the kind of commission that maybe results in a grand building, but I think it could result in really interesting thinking about how an architecture of separation can reinforce community in other ways. And yeah, so yeah, I think I wish people were approaching it as a design challenge.
On a sort of more grassroots level, one thinks of the banging of the pots and pans that emerged as a little ritual during pandemic. Yeah. Yes, please. Next question.
Sure. So most of when we think of quarantine, we think of quarantining against pathogens, against sort of non-human elements that are going to kill us or destroy plants or animals. But I often feel in an airport, when I'm in between countries and quarantine from between one nation to another, before I enter that nation, I'm in a state of quarantine, or in that security zone in a state of quarantine, or taken into certain rooms.
Yeah.
And it's designed that way. It's purposely designed to keep people. And I think at the borders, at the Mexican border, U.S.-Mexican border, there's also these no-man zones or places where we're purposely kept apart from other people, not what the people are carrying, but the people themselves. And Geoff, like you mentioned, with the ghetto in Venice, and then ghettos throughout the world, where people are kept away because of who they are, not because of what they might be possessing. So I'm not sure how much you've encountered that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, no, yeah. I mean, the thing that they would be carrying would be ideology or an idea or a different kind of threat. I think that someone is bringing in what's seen as a cultural risk or potentially a political risk, and that it's quarantine in a politically literal sense, in that this person is seen as a potential risk to a way of life or to a political system, et cetera. But yeah, it is a very, very similar process, and I think that kind of architecture where you're marbling entry inside and outside. I mean, you see it with plant and animal quarantine, and you see it at border stations and airports.
But I mean, the American plan was precisely a response to women becoming more independent, working outside the home. This happens in 1918. In the period from 1900 to 1910, there was a 50% increase in women working outside the home. That's terrifying if you're, a member of the patriarchy. Suddenly these women are not dependent on you for their their livelihood, and so or their means of taking care of themselves. So quarantine comes in as a way to sort of try to control that and exercise some control over what seems like a terrifying and they were a generation adrift, these loose women, and so yeah, you see it applied with prejudice to sort of anything that makes people uncomfortable, whether that be a pathogen or simply a woman who is not reliant on you for the roof over her head,
Next question.
Hi, is it on? Okay. You talked quite a bit about quarantine fatigue and different notions of acceptable risk, and I'm intrigued about when quarantine ends and how that's decided, and specifically right now with the divergence between the West's sort of acceptance of COVID as a thing that just exists as part of our lives and China's current policy. And I'm wondering if you know of any historical parallels between that kind of divergence or places that have decided to continue quarantine longer than others when faced with a similar issue.
Yeah, there's a bunch of examples. There's a pretty famous one in England. There's a village called Eyam that was they basically sort of preemptively locked themselves away from. It was the
Black Death.
Black Death, correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
And even instituted really on a level of design. Actually, would use vinegar pools outside the village walls where you could put coins. Vinegar was seen as a disinfectant. So you could actually engage in economic exchange with the residents of this town who knew that they had the disease but were isolating themselves from the rest of society, kind of just to take one for the team, so to speak. But even within the practice of quarantine in that era as well, there was another great example. There's a historian at, is she in Oxford, I think, Jane Crawshaw. But she writes about a really interesting phenomenon where towns that were getting ready to come out of quarantine, or cities rather, would preemptively, they would basically internally come out of quarantine while staying isolated from the rest of the world and kind of try to get back up to speed. So it was almost like a large theatrical production of performing everyday life. And so they would kind of see, like, is it working? Are we back on our feet? Is this something that we can handle? And then they would finally open up the outside gates, and then they would rejoin the outside world. But so there are kind of differential quarantines even within certain cultures. So it's not even the U.S. versus China or the Swedish model versus Australia, which were two nations that had extraordinarily different quarantine policies. But actually within polities and within from one city to the next, there might be differences and gradations and isolation and how to manage that.
I think you're absolutely right that there's also always a different valuation put on acceptable risk versus like the benefits of trade and travel. So as Geoff mentioned, Britain was really averse to, it's funny, sort of Britain went from being such a backwater during the Black Death that it didn't really invest in quarantine facilities the same way the Mediterranean and Adriatic ports did, because they were the sites of trade and commerce, to by the time, the next round of lazarettos, quarantine facilities are being built during the cholera outbreaks, Britain is so dependent on free trade that it cannot bear any interruption of that, even to save lives. So at that point, Britain is resistant to quarantine for sort of different reasons. And so there is very much always built into quarantine a question of the costs and benefits. And it's often sort of a narrowly economic thing, where the benefits of trade and travel outweigh economically the potential lives lost. And so you can see countries making that decision differently now, and what their level of acceptable isolation is too.
I think we have time for just one more question. Go ahead.
Hello. First of all, thanks for the presentation. And I remember in the beginning you showed us some examples of older cases of quarantine in which the infected were placed physically apart, but very distantly. And then you showed us some very interesting examples of more modern cases in which the infected are not necessarily placed in a huge distance. And I saw that there is a potential for many creative solutions in this case. But I was wondering, do you think that people will somehow irrationally resist to these modern solutions and they will still want them placed far away?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the irrational fear is obviously a huge part of pandemic response. Yeah, and I think you're undoubtedly right. Distance feels safer than perhaps the technological solution often, you know, particularly if it's an invisible technological solution. But yeah, I you know, for example, those care cubes, it's fascinating. Like, the barrier feels very thin, you know, and that allows a connection, but also seems riskier whether it is or not. So yeah, I think it's it.
Well, no, yeah, I'd say definitely, because I mean, I think that you see it actually, even with COVID-19, you know, there were some early attempts in one of the first places in the US that was affected by COVID was Snohomish County in Washington State. And there's an example that's actually literally the opening example of our book in the first paragraph. It was just this totally spectacular event where, you know, because we had already been writing this book for a long time, and so we were thinking about quarantine. But the county used public health funds to purchase an Econo Lodge and turn it into a quarantine facility. And it was unbelievable because what they did is to signify that it was now a quarantine facility, they sent a guy wearing a Tyvek you know, protective suit. He gets out of a van and he paints the sign black. And so it's still glowing and says Econo Lodge, but then he just covers it in black paint until it just like signifies nothing. And it's such an incredible example of just sort of canceling a place and saying this is now a non-place, it's a quarantine facility. But I mentioned that because there was a lot of outcry about that. You know, it was in a poorer neighborhood, which is why it was an affordable hotel. So it was seen as you know, a socially unjust positioning of risk because it was like saying, hey, we'll quarantine, but we're going to do it in a poor neighborhood. So now they have to worry about, you know, having COVID-19 people nearby. But you saw that with, or rather we saw that with a lot of the controversy around citing the animal and vegetable research facilities where they were. There was a lot of pushback about, you know, do we really want to have an animal research facility in the middle of cattle country? And it took a lot of sort of coaxing and public hearings to convince people that this was a risk that can be managed. So I definitely think that you do see that now, and I think you know, if you were to hear that, you know, I don't know, there was a building or like the third, I don't know what floor we're on right now, but like some floor in this building, you know, was being used for you know, overseas students who had some sort of unknown blood disease. I absolutely guarantee there would be pushback in terms of the risk that MIT was taking on or that students in this building had.
And people who would not feel safe coming to this building, no matter what you told them about the technological precautions, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think that you saw that during the Ebola outbreak too. I mean, the individual who, unfortunately, not to get into politics, but became president soon thereafter, Donald Trump was quite famous for saying, you know, stop the flights. You know, he wanted people to be basically banned from Africa from even entering the United States. And we talk about this in the book, but during the Ebola outbreak, it got to the point where public educational officials, like someone would take a vacation to East Africa where there wasn't even an Ebola outbreak, and then they would return and they'd have to be, you know, their job was at risk. They were told not to come anywhere near school.
Parents would be like, you can't, you're putting our kids at risk.
But you're thousands of miles away from the outbreak. But so any sort of overlap from that kind of thing was seen as I mean, even to the point actually where there was a confirmed Ebola case in, I want to say it was Dallas, Texas. And then someone went to like an educational conference in Houston, Texas. And then when they flew back to their home somewhere else in the United States, you know, they were basically told to isolate, to quarantine, and they weren't allowed back into everyday society. So, I mean, I think absolutely, like that idea of distance equaling safety is extremely prevalent in, I think, the human psyche in general, just to be honest, you know, whatever that statement really means. But I just think it's an integral part of how we think about keeping ourselves safe.
And it's one of the things we write about in the book as well, because the instinct is to quarantine someone. Better safe than sorry, right? Like, of course, why not? But then this is why you have to construct such thoughtful public health regulations around this power because it will be abused. People are afraid. They're not the ones who are going to have to stay home, so why not quarantine, you know? And so it is definitely something that needs as much thought around the ethics and the regulations that structure its use as the design of the experience as well.
I believe on that note, we'll end the discussion for now. But thank you for guiding us through these very much unsettled questions in which we all have a stake and all of us have hands-on experience now. Yeah, and thank you for coming here tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, for the record.